So this session will review a little bit yesterday and then go into the point or the theme, and I'd like to have a discussion of this, and I'd like to present my model and some of the reasons for my model. So, okay, are you on? Am I on? Okay, so let me review a moment the notions, the background, the historical background in which Gestalt psychology, which is an early form of systems theory, began to be presented to the West, or to our intellectual world. And in the turn of the century, 1918 or so, the psychological establishment, the intellectual climate, and the scientific climate assumed there were fundamental entities, or tried to assume fundamental entities for psychology. Like the behaviorism began to make its impact, and it was under the paradigm of science, reducing things to their fundamental elements. And there was a search made to find the fundamental elements of psychological behavior. That was termed the conditioned response, Pavlov, Watson, and these people. And many laboratories were set up to study human behavior in terms of that. What can we then generate out of this research program that will give us the fundamental elements of behavior? This was seen by certain people later to be called the Gestalt psychologists as a reduction of a complexity to fundamental forms that lose the nature of the complexity of a form. And the notion of Gestalt comes into the foreground as a notion that something is greater than the sum of its parts, and we call that a whole, or a gestalten, a pattern, a formation that can never be reduced to its elements in a reductionistic way that science had great success with the physical world, but not with the psychological world. And so the Gestalt psychologists in Germany began to explore notions of part and whole in terms of the notion that a whole is greater than the sum of its parts and cannot be made sense of by enumerating the parts, like you could with chemical molecules and atomic theories and so on. And this then gained great impetus and interest in the intellectual climate of the 30s and 40s, and Gestalt psychology, Gestalt theory, was one of the reigning paradigms of explanation of behavior, along with the Freudian behavior, the Freudian model and the Marxist socialist model were probably the most powerful models. Well, Gestalt is essentially a theory of systems theories. How do we make an account of complex systems? How do we describe them? How do we pay attention to them? How do we explore them? Because I showed you yesterday this emergent global properties. This is another example of this notion this is the same thing. This is the notion similar to Gestalt, and this is from modern systems theory, biology, and so on, about emergent properties, or that this global, emergent global property is what the Gestaltists would try to talk about as an emergent whole, a whole system that is different than the sum of its parts. And that this is the way we get what we try to talk about now in terms of cultural phenomenon, and also this notion that emergent properties have dependent origination. That the form of a self, a personality, a family system, a symphonic sound, a candle flame, there's an appearance there of the flame, and it's dependent on the oxygen-carbon cycles. It's dependent on the fuel of the wax for this form to appear. And the form of the candle, the flame, is different than the sum of its parts. It's something, again, another level of phenomenon. And as I want to talk about, I think the self is also this, that it's an emergent property. It's dependent on a living being living in a social context for there to be any form of what we call a personality, or any shape to this. And before I can get to that, I need to read something, because these ideas of what a Gestalt is and how Gestalten are formed, what the process of complex phenomenon is about, rests on an old dilemma in our world of philosophy, of taking account of the nature of things. This is a couple of long paragraphs, but I want to read them because they're important to our theme here. As we're talking about identity of something, how do we know something is the same as it once was? How do we know something has an identity? So this is an entry in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Identity. People age. Some trees regularly shed their leaves. Ice melts with the coming of spring, and wood, when burned, gives way to fire and ash. The world seems to be in perpetual flux, undergoing ceaseless transformation. Yet in spite of the alterations we notice, we want to say that this is the same tree that shed its leaves last month, that this adult is the same person we knew as a child, and that this pool of water is made up of the same stuff as the piece of ice which melted there. Philosophical reflection about the nature of change, about the problem of identifying or re-identifying something or someone, gives rise to a set of issues which cluster under the name of the problem of identity. In its simplest form, this problem may be thought of as the problem of trying to give a true explanation of those features of the world which account for its sameness on the one hand and for its diversity and change on the other. Put in modern terminology, the problem is that of trying to give a true account of the uses or use of such words as same, identity, change, and diversity, and for such related expressions as similar, like, and different, in order to delineate those features of the world which use or uses these terms, or which the use or uses of these terms is intended to mark out. The outlook suggested by our unreflective apprehension of the world that at any given moment it exhibits features of both permanence and change, of both sameness and difference, is sometimes called the common sense view of the world. This view seems supported by logical considerations as well as those based upon observation. For it seems a matter of logic that when someone truly asserts of something that it is changing, he thereby implies that there is a something which remains unchanged and unaffected by the transformation that, quotes, it undergoes. The identification of that which remains untouched by change while undergoing change has traditionally been part of the philosopher's task. If one believes that any correct philosophical analysis of the world must ultimately do justice to our common sense view of it, the problem becomes singularly acute, for the philosopher is often driven to a picture of the world which is incompatible with this common sense view. On the one hand, he seems impelled, as Heraclitus presumably was, to maintain that the world is nothing but process and flux, and nothing remains untouched by or immune to change. On the other hand, he is often driven to the position that there must be something which remains exempt from change. And Zeno and Parmenides stand on that side of the fence. In the history of this problem, the common sense view stands as a watershed dividing thinkers into two great streams, particularly over the question of whether the world is really changing or not. Most of the great theories of antiquity, such as those of Heraclitus, Parmenides, Zeno, and Plato, fall on one side or other of this watershed. They affirm either that nothing in reality remains constant, or that whatever is real cannot change, and hence whatever appears to be changing is unreal and illusory. That's the crux of the problem. Theories of personality are based on these positions, and generally one or the other. And in Gestalt or systems theory, we're presented with this problem once again. How do we call something a whole or an identity? What shape does it have? Does it have a changing identity? Does it have a self-nature that we can recognize, like the old man is the child we once knew? How is that possible? So all these theories that we're working with in terms of personality change also assume a personality structure. And they're basically divided into two streams. The one, which is systems theory, is that there is, in Buddhism, there is no substantial self. And then there is what is called the essentialist school, that there is an essential domain of awareness that doesn't change, and in fact has immortality as either a part of God or a part of the absolute nature of things, that there is no change, that this being that you are has a soul that is eternal and unchanging. It's an unchanging platform of awareness, or something like that. So this divide informs almost all theories of what a personality is. Most of these theories that we're talking about that come from the unchanging soul are considered, or have been throughout history, known as the religious or theological position, that you're a part of God, a part of an unchanging entity, and your essence essentially is not unique or singular. It's actually part of God, which is unchanging. Okay, so that's the situation when we come to how to work with Gestalt model, because the Gestalt model says that we aren't anything substantial. The Buddhist model says that too, that like the candle flame, we are an appearance that is like a product of dependent origination, and that it comes about that this form that we say is Tori or Uta or TS has attributes because of its place in its context. That the context provides the material for this Gestalten to form, or an emergent property, an emergent phenomenon. And Gestalt is working at this in terms of, we're saying that throughout the lifetime of a person, they are constantly changing. They're having to change, and the phenomenon of their awareness field will always be presenting some new material for them to deal with. That it's not the same person the next minute or the next hour or the next day. There's something totally different happening than happened earlier in this, whatever we call this entity of the I or the personality. And that the way to work is to assume that change is going on all the time, and that your job as a therapist is to help that person recognize that what was once their identity point is no longer valid for being an identity point, and that they must respond, in a sense, to new adaptive necessities.
See, we're not to nitpick, but
yeah.
Are those really an either-or situation? Or couldn't they just be both simultaneously true?
Well, let me lay out my position, and then let's do the nitpicking, because it isn't nitpicking. It's
Okay.
important points.
Okay.
So here's this is
I don't agree with you.
okay. You don't have to agree with me, but right now I want to say this, and then we'll talk about what you agree with or don't. So this is my position, that consciousness, self-identity, cannot be defined as an entity or an essence, as it is a continuum. It's a process. And we can come back to this and argue this, or discuss it. Now, okay, I can hold this. So, here's the way I'm looking at things, and it's in a sense informed from what I understand from biological theory or Darwinian theory of the adaptive nature of life forms. That this is an adaptive argument. That I believe that the entity that we call the human is a process and never has a full shape or form that one could say, this is something that's going to stay there the same. That the baby is so different, that the old man is so transformed by their changes that they're not the same person as the baby was. And that what we're doing when we're working with Gestalt is that we're trying to find in the developmental phases of the personality and in their growth, where are they located in terms of their developmental adaptive necessities. And this is a theory that from conception to death, there's going to be a lot of change, and there will be almost constant identity crises. That because when you're born, you come into the world, your body is a certain way. And throughout your life, your body never remains the same. It is constantly changing. From a very small form to a large form, then to puberty, when the issues are gender issues. What sex am I? What themes come up in terms of how your body is changing and presenting you with new adaptive necessities. That at puberty, the questions that you had, the identity questions and issues, are different than you have now. Unless, and this theme has not been laid to rest, if this theme of puberty and your identity as a sexual being is still a powerful question for you, this issue is still weaving itself through you at a later issue if you haven't confronted this issue. This is one of the things that happens when we're doing work with people, is that we'll find that as a 40-year-old, often they haven't really developed or gone through really thoroughly the developmental issue that came up at puberty. What is my sex? What is my identity as a male or a female, or something in between? So that this adaptive necessities demand change. And that if you are trying to hang on to some conception or idea of who you were or how it all worked well for you at an earlier phase, in a different phase, then you're going to be in trouble, and you're essentially, what I would say is that you're not able to change in the Buddhist sense. You're not able to recognize that life is all change, and that what was once who you thought you were it's outdated. You need to change. You need to let go of that old identity and enter into what is your new body and your new identity, your new roles that culture demands of you. It's a sense that your body is changing, and the culture has little, let's say, slots for you, roles. We call them roles. That the role of an adult is different than the role of the child. The role of the old man is different than the role of the young man, and there are places for you to put this ever-changing body as you go from conception to death. Okay, so that's the model I'm operating from, and I'm assuming that when I'm working with someone, their foreground, their awareness field, will be reflecting their adaptive dilemma. What are they dealing with? It's dealing with what is developmentally an unfinished situation. Okay, so that's my presentation of my position, and I'd like to talk about that and discuss it.
Well, you're obviously coming from the point of no soul.
Right. Right. So that, and this is the old dilemma of, like, if I assume a soul, an eternal being, how is it that there is such a thing as the singular nature of all living things? And this is my position in the sense that if you assume that there's going to be some essence that you're searching for within the personality, you're going to be turning towards something that isn't changeable, and that you won't be able to be catching on and being supportive and working with this flux of changes, this system of interactions that the organism is trying to make sense of. Now, this is an arguable point. I'm, coming from this position of that there is no soul, or there is no substantial entity that doesn't change. I don't know. I mean, I'm in a position of, like, I'm interested in the question, the theme of this question of, is there change? Is there really change? And that the nature of the systems of therapy that, or descriptions of personality, giving an account of personality in terms of, there is an essence we're going to search for. We're going to search for this entity, this whole person, are mistaken. And that what we find is that the organism, the personality, the question of identity is a continuum and a process, and nothing remains the same. There may be elements from the old brought into the new, but essentially, when you look more closely, that's a minor thing. It's a trivial attribute. It's not really the strongest element of the phenomenon of this person trying to adapt and change. So I want to shut up for
Even dropping the whole aspect of the soul.
yeah.
Whether or not there's some mystical aspect that moves from
Mhm.
life to life, where
Mhm.
each one of our lives is perhaps a day in the life of the soul.
Yeah.
Even dropping that whole question, there are certain things that continue with me in the sense of my memories, how I hold myself. There are certain things that continue even through the process of this life. And you know, to make a statement that those are always in a state of flux, well, you know, clearly when I die, they won't be there. Some of them won't be there anymore. And yet, there are things that I've brought with me from puberty on, memories, attitudes about myself, sort of insubstantial things that still exist and run me. So,
Right, that gives me pause when I think of those attributes of like that in this account I just read, that in order to give an account of change, you have to say there's something stable to change against. That in a way, the logic of that position drives you into the position that there must be something that we're saying stands against change. So, Yuta, you wanted to say something?
I mean, I would like to talk from my own experience.
Yeah.
How I experience my development.
Uh-huh.
And for me, it's more an unfolding process. What I'm aware, I don't see myself that I'm changing, or that I'm. I mean, what's on this scene there? It's
Seymour,
maybe roles for me, but that's a different level
Uh-huh.
for me than this psychological level. So it's two parts.
Uh-huh.
So I see it more than a kind of seed, and this seed unfolds its life.
Uh-huh.
And for this, there is an unchanging part in me, and I can see the same thing in the nature as well. That there is a part, and there is a lot of possibility of different shapes and gestalts which are coming out from the same thing, which are relying on the environmental support, or on the ground, on the background.
Uh-huh.
But I still feel that there's something very substantial.
Uh-huh.
This is no change,
Uh-huh.
and I can see this is going through my life.
Mhm.
The awareness is changing for me. That's something what I'm experiencing
Mhm. Mhm.
of these things, but I never have the feeling that it's something really new.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Do either of you have something to say or add to this?
I think in some ways it doesn't matter, because my sense is what you do is you sit with someone, and you, when they're in a transition or something, you're there to help them integrate their different parts. Now the question is, those different parts, are those instantaneously emerging moment to moment to moment, or is there some continuity across their whole lifetime? So the second one, there's an identity which is continuing to evolve. The first one is like, there's no identity. In a way, I don't think it matters. When you're sitting with them, I imagine what is at issue is part of them split off or something like that. So from minimalist point of view, it's not the relevant question. I think all the other stuff you're talking about, what you do, let's say you were wrong, I think what you do is still really good. Let's say that I do have an identity and there's consistency. What you do works.
Uh-huh.
And it's, you know, it's sexy, or it's fun to talk about this, and there's this constant, and you could say, well, how much is constant? You know, so 80% of my behavior is constant since I was a kid, and things like that, or do people change that much? But I think the work you do, you would work with me or someone and say, you know, what's up, what's not there,
Mhm.
and whether it's an unfolding across time or the patterns that emerge in that moment, I think it looks the same what you will do.
Mhm.
And a healthy experience for me would be the same. So in some way,
Mhm.
the question doesn't intrigue me.
Mhm.
What intrigues me is, okay, what's next? How do we
Mhm.
integrate?
Mhm. Mhm.
Not much fun.
As I look at nature, I see that all things change with time, slowly, moment by moment, month by month. The earth shifts slowly, the tree grows slowly, it dies slowly. This room is changing second by second. The wood is oxidizing, things are changing, and my suspicion is the human being is just very much like most things in nature. It is changing, growing. For example, between birth and death, in general, there's no event other than the birth of a child that marks parenting, but still parenting doesn't happen on the day the child is born. So parenting happens before, it happens from conception on. The
Mhm.
day after birth is essentially not
Mhm.
much different than the day before. So to me, it looks like there's just a continuum of change from birth to death, day by day by day. There's no sharp division between family takes over, retirement and old age. They're sliding off at I
Mhm.
mean, just because you retire, somebody gives you a watch, you've been preparing for that for 2 years or 5 years or 4 years, and you'll go on adjusting to it for 2 or 3 or 4 years. So I see it as just a slow flow, like the growth and death of a tree.
Mhm. Mhm. I see it somewhat that way too, and what I'm currently having in my mind is like there's this period of, let's say, a 5-year spectrum that, let's say, at birth or at conception and up until 5 years old, the organism is coming into the world and there are so many changes that they need to adapt to that there's a period of, let's say, 3 years of identity crises. Who am I? What am I up to? Where am I? And then there's a period of, let's say, from 4 to 5 where this child is pretty much solidified in their identity and they pretty much feel and fit within their context, in their family and in their neighborhood and their surroundings. They're kind of aware of who they are. All of these questions before who I am, all the adjustments that it took to make that pattern of the I that that person feels themselves to be, changes from constant confusion to a period of relative harmony and consistency and organization that seems like it is regular. Now what happens when that child enters school? There's a whole new period of identity that appears then. What was once solidified and fitting now doesn't fit anymore. The person has to adjust to socialization, the world is bigger, and they're thrown once more into a crisis of identity, which I assume will take about 3 years. By 8 or 9, the child starts to feel, okay, I'm okay with who I am now. I've gone through all the developmental, adaptive problems. I've learned to be who I am. I've adjusted. My body is adjusted. I'm kind of stable. And from 10 to 12, pretty much they're okay. And then puberty hits. And a whole new generation of a whole new question of who they are comes into being, and they're struggling and searching with who they are. That's kind of a rough thumb description that I have and what I'm looking at when I'm working with people, that I'm assuming there will be periods where, like the river of life runs through rapids and there isn't really much stability. And then there will be a period where there is calm and quiet and the life flows along it without too much turbulence. Danny?
Well, I think about, a lot of the primitive tribes, that those were passages, and I mean that there would be huge ceremonies to take
Right.
people through.
Right. And in a sense, psychotherapy is a kind of a rite of passage ritual in our culture for those kinds of things. So that people visit the psychotherapist when they're going through a turbulent crisis and can't make sense of it. I don't think there's much we can do except sit with them and keep helping them to confront the raw edges of the new personality, the new adaptive demands, and support them as they learn how to cope. That they're going to take 2 to 3 years to get through this turbulence, and that what we're doing is helping them sort the issue out. And that my job is, in a sense, to try to keep them task-oriented, in the sense of keeping them phase-specific. That I'm trying to get them to pay attention to what seems to be their existential theme, the major theme at this point in their life. And as I encourage them to confront that, then we'll start to fly out all the phenomenon of unfinished phases, all the things that they have in the way of adapting that weren't done earlier or were only partially finished earlier, and then come to the foreground in this new state of their development. And a lot of what I feel I'm doing is weaving the here and now with the past, in the sense that the person being confronted with the here and now will not be able to really confront the here and now, because there will be adaptive tasks unfinished, or they will be thrown into a traumatization or a period of traumatization that they haven't lived through yet, but this new developmental phase is creating this material, is generating this material to come to the foreground of their awareness again. So that I'm trying to say that, or I'm trying to work with them in the sense of picking out when do they get stuck in making contact, when is the phase of their awareness in digesting or contacting their environment, where are the conflicts in them contacting or connecting with or engaging in this existential theme. Yeah.
Well, it seems like it would be this thing about soul, or it's almost like a deeper identity, that it's like I'm going through puberty, I'm not puberty, or I'm going through parenting, and somehow connecting with a deeper identity. It seemed almost like the rudder or the keel of a boat, that it would feel like to me going through these different phases would be a lot easier.
Mm-hmm. 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 And I mean, people with an orientation of a soul, of a keel of the boat in some sense, may be doing exactly the same thing that I'm doing, in the sense that I'm looking for regularities or points of identity that feel like, okay, this is me, this is really me, and it's going through this, as you say, going through puberty. Even though I'm going through puberty, I have some kind of sense of my identity that isn't this theme. And that's another important perspective as a Gestaltist, is to also, my look at it is that we start off with 4 or 5 identity points, and we keep adding to that. As we get older, there are more and more complexities added to our existence and the points of our identity. In some sense, I share with some of you that the person that's sitting here looking out at the world is no different than I remember myself at 3 years old, in a certain way. The platform of my regard is the same, as far as I can tell.
Danny, your comment that going through this transition, it may feel better if I have a sense that I'm going through that transition. Now, feeling better, that may be in effect. The question is what's true. And so sometimes people, or I, or people in general, fabricate certain structures to give them comfort. And so the question is, if you didn't have that comfort, it may actually be more invigorating or more vital somehow to say, yeah, I've had all these experiences in the past, and now I'm entering a new phase in my life. And there's something new there, and not relying on continuity, but just accept it as this is new. So Seymour's idea, it might be scary. I mean, the first time I heard him talk about no self, I was mixed with anger towards him or frustration or something. And it may have just been fearfulness of like nothing to hold on to. That I find comfort in the sense of I'm going through all this. So the idea of the I being more vague, it's like there's this newly emerging stuff. It means I always have to stay on my toes in some way. Which is, I don't feel comfortable doing that, and I may feel more vital somehow.
Well, I feel like I'm kind of dealing with this theme as a major question when I'm listening to people report their existence and describe their existence, is that there are two central metaphors being used in descriptions of themselves. Self-descriptions of themselves as a container that has boundaries, that has shape, and is a, let's say, an entity and an agency. And the other metaphor, I'm a continuum, I'm a process. And that it seems that people are shifting back and forth between one or the other of these metaphors. That some of the time you'll be describing and experiencing yourself as a process, as a continuum. And that exploration, or clusters of the potential, the parts of you that make up your identity, can't be captured as a container metaphor. It's like a continuum. Like, where do you begin and your family leave off? That's a continuum concept. That your family and you form a continuum in some sense. And at the same time, I can look at you, look at Tori, look at Yuta, look at Dennis, or look at T.S., and say, oh, that's the shape of Dennis. It's an entity, it's a container. It's like, that's the shape of you. And I recognize you as having that shape and form. And then I'm using a container or entity metaphor. And so, what I'm trying to do is, in a sense, one of the things that I'm doing, not the thing, but one of the things that I'm doing is I'm listening to people when they describe themselves as a container, and when they use that metaphor for a situation that is a continuum or process situation. Or the opposite, like Danny's example, when you're in a continuum, when you're in a situation where this sense of who I am is contained in the idea of an essence or an identity, the keel of the ship, that when I'm in that place and try to describe myself as a continuum, I get confused. So that I'm trying to help people in a certain way of challenging them when they have a container metaphor, when they're in a continuum, or when they're in a container experience, challenging them when they have a continuum metaphor. Like, what is, let's say in challenging a continuum metaphor, I would ask them to say, is there some part of you that recognizes yourself in all of this flux? Where is the entity, the location of the self? Now, all of this that's on the wall and that I'm talking to you about started about 10 years ago. And I was pretty secure about what I thought a self was. And then I began to get really questioning what the hell is a self? I mean, really, when I tried to make sense of a self, which was once quite apparent to me, I began to find lots of problems about identity in this. That the self assumes a bounded entity, it assumes an agency and an identity that is, in some sense, not enough to take into account of the complexity of consciousness, the amazingly complex constellation of activities that go on with the person, with myself, or with the situation of working with someone. The metaphor of the container is a very powerful metaphor in our culture in a sense, and it generates the self-reliance theories and the ideas about identity being responsible for everything that happens to them. The Western man is an identity, an entity, and an agency opposed to the world, and the surrounding world is, in some sense, a competitor to the I, that the I stands off and is separate from the world. And that's a major theme in our world of the European colonies, that this idea of the individual is a very powerful one. And it leads to problems in terms of the idea that you're self-reliant, and the assumption of a self-reliance doesn't permit you to make allies and to join in the continuum metaphor of the parts of the world that you need to survive. In the sense that this individual, this organism, as I see it, is not only a whole into itself, that whole itself is a part of a social structure, and that the human being is a social animal. And that part of the task of working with people has to do with them helping them connect with the interdependent nature of their surroundings, that there are dependencies that they will never lose, that they will always have to, in some sense, be calling upon the world around them for aid and support. And the old model of the Freudian idea, and even in the early Gestalt work of, like, the point of this work is to get the person to identify extremely strongly as a container metaphor, that I am the source of all of my activities, I am the source of all of my experiences, is, I think, an illusory proposition and doesn't fit the nature of the facts.
There's at least one other emergent metaphor, though.
Yeah.
You know, the metaphor would be no self.
Mm-hmm.
And the number 3 down there would be all phenomena are in some way illusory. And in parentheses would be non-duality.
Right. Right.
And that may not be that relevant in most day-to-day Gestalt, and yet at the same time it's an emergent metaphor that can transform someone's view of themselves, and in that way be a Gestalt in its totality.
Right. Right. But I think, I mean, in a sense, I think that one of the things that I'm acutely aware of as a clinician, as a person who works with people, is that it is very important that part of my task as a responsible people helper is to stay current in terms of how do I understand my theory? What is my theory? How does it stand up against other theories? And then I'm constantly refining that. So that in a sense, yes, on the day-to-day basis, my theory isn't so important. I'm kind of catch as catch can. I'm doing whatever seems to fit the situation. I draw from every theory and put it into work. Yet, I feel that these 5 principles guide my behavior, and I am conversant with maybe 20 different theories of personality and clinical practice. But I keep returning to these basic principles as the organizing metaphors that I use when I'm working with people, that I'm looking for evidence of this kind of situation. I'm trying to encourage this kind of representation of their being, and also that I have then, in a sense, an ideology. I have, in a sense, dogma. I hope it's a flexible dogma, in the sense that I use it as a dogma when I'm working, when I'm a philosopher or a theoretician, and someone who is clinically questioning and theoretically questioning. I have to put my dogma aside and present it like I'm presenting it here, that some of this helps inform my work. It's how I use my work as a clinical leverage, what I'm doing when I'm looking for leverage or activities to intervene. What am I doing when I intervene? Rests on a kind of a dogma. The dogma of the no-self, with constant change. But when I begin to ponder these questions, I find my theory doesn't fit all of the facts in some way. And I'm still then puzzled by the issue of what happens when a person doesn't have a sense of substantiality, a sense of that there is something enduring through all of these changes, that there isn't something stable and regular. So, I'm not sure where I want to go with this at this point.
Can I ask a question, Steve?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you use this structure, but other Gestalt people I know, they talk about a person structuring their experience in certain ways or organizing their experience. And maybe you yesterday mentioned that.
Mm-hmm.
We all organize our experience radically differently. If we ever knew that, we'd be surprised. My sense is that people do that rather consistently through their life, except if some trauma happens that they reorganize.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm starting to think that your continuum dichotomy may be useful, that if I have this way of structuring which I developed as a child
Mm-hmm.
and I survived my childhood with that, and now it doesn't fit, and I'm holding myself rigidly with that organization, that it may be that I'm viewing myself as a container when it's actually a continuum, or anyhow.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's say, those of you who have been working with me in sensory awareness, that I'm asking you, let's say, to pick up a rock, put a rock down, explore your breathing, deal with your sitting, what is going on. In a sense, I'm giving you experiments, and I'm watching your responses to those experiments in terms of this continuum container model, in a sense, that when I see you try to stabilize yourself, like if I'm working at sitting and I notice that you're not moving here, you're aware of here, movable, I'm assuming that the organism is there as a constantly adaptive system in gravity. And so when I see that you're not constantly adapting or changing, then I bring into my experimentation experiments that ask you to wake up in this region and be able to feel that this region is being held as if it's containing something, that it's a container, and that what I'm asking you to do is find out, oh, it's changeable, it's movable. And that maybe the metaphor of container, continuum, or stable and movable is, in a sense, well, I don't want to go on that point, but anyway, yeah?
It seems like what you're saying then is the container is a continuum.
That I'm trying to change or to give you experiments that bring into question the very nature of what you're doing with your structure that makes it a container. And then I raise into question, if you stay with this container model of belief and self-image, that my shoulders don't move, my neck and shoulders are fixed, then you can never find balance. What will help you is if I start to give you experiments that have you begin to explore the continuum or flexibility model, and then you come down to exploring sitting with a new appreciation for all of this subtle shifts in your organism. Now these shifts, these changes, these adaptive responses to new circumstances go on in all different levels. Not only is it going on in terms of how you're dealing with gravity, but it's going on in terms of psychology, of how you deal with your surround of people and things. That are, if you're feeling that you're fixed, if you have the container conception, often you won't be able to, as you say, move into the new change. But I was trying to bring an example to you people who've worked with me now, like when I'm doing sensory awareness, my major concern is to get you to feel all of the different changes that are potential there for you in terms of letting your organism move. It's as if you see yourself as a fist, and this is a substantial sense of your identity, then I ask you to explore, are there other possibilities here than being a fist, a container, or holding? Can you move your fingers and find that your hand has other possibilities than a fist, which I would call a container metaphor, a container self-identity, rather than a continuum of process rather than stable. So that when I'm working with people, also, and here's the other side of the situation, that when I'm working with you, I'm assuming that there will be movement and there will be stillness. Now this is another point of where we're talking about, instead of the fist being a container, here's the metaphor that my stillness is a kind of a continuity, or let's say the rudder that Danny speaks of, or the sense of the deep self that doesn't change, that there is movability in you, and at the same time there is what in meditation practices we'd call the center, or the sense of rootedness, or a sense of stability, that change takes place against the picture of it. Stability is the context, change is the foreground. So when I'm working with someone who's working with me, I will be paying attention to their body in terms of what is in stillness and what is in movement. And I'll be bringing into awareness for them these themes. What is stillness, what is still in you, what is non-movable, what is staying the same, and what is changing. In the sense that I'm trying to bring about an awareness that is accepting of the dualisms that we are embedded within. and this is going back to something you said earlier, Tori, of erasing. The major thing to do in Gestalt work is to change a person's conceptual apparatus, the way they're dealing with themselves and their environment, from an either-or position to a both-ands position. Changing statements of I'm either black and not white, or I'm white and not black, that what is true of human nature is that we are a continuum of processes. We are a complexity of dualities. That both ends of the spectrum are the extremes, and we live mostly within this gray area, this gray zone between being flexible and adaptable and being inflexible and not adaptable, or firm. There's some resting place, some place of substantial no change, and then there's a place of everything is changed. That we're flowing between these two polarities, and that our work with people is to in a sense, help them evoke and be responsive to all of those domains or potential domains of being.
So it seems to me like you can get stuck in the container, and what you do is you take somebody into a continuum, whether a continuum of awareness, a continuum, because I mean you can't really get stuck if you're moving, if you're a continuum. But you could also get stuck in a continuum of, I mean, someone that's sort of going with the flow, but they don't take care of their body.
Right.
The container.
Right. And that's like in the extreme, we would say that the extremes of this in terms of family systems model is the fragmented family or personality. There's too much, let's say, change or too many entities floating around there. And the opposite extreme is the enmeshed family, that there's not enough difference. There's too much difference here, too much differentiation, and just fragmentation. And on the other end of the continuum is there's too much sameness, too much enmeshment, too much holding to what has always been true, or family traditions, that the person in a typical enmeshed family can't differentiate. They're not allowed to escape the family rules and metaphors and values, and to form a sense of themselves in distinction from the family of origin.
So, I think maybe I didn't understand something at the beginning when you talked. I feel that I misunderstood you because now it seems that there's the same value for continuum and container, what you express. Am I right?
Yeah.
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 So, but at the beginning I had the feeling that it was more a plaidoyer for a non-self. So, I mean, I think both is true. Huh? It's not an either or. So the container might be the self, and the continuum might be the unself. And for me, it's not a question either or, just a point where you look, from what you look at.
Yeah. And that's what you said, Tori, earlier today when we were at the newspaper stand. It appears as a container from the perspective that you look at it. Depends on where you're looking at it. The phenomenon of being, the phenomenon of consciousness, at one moment it looks like it's a container, an entity, a substantial point of reference that doesn't change. And you look at it from another perspective and you find it's a continuum. And this is the puzzle and paradox of, I think, existence. It's in a sense going back to the old formulation of the Gestalt picture of the goblet and the faces. That my experience is that we are shifting constantly between the faces and the vase. And from one moment we feel ourselves to be a substantial entity, and the next moment we're not. But that's what I'm trying to talk about here. And I'm, took a position of no self in order to draw out this issue of what a dilemma that brings me into a dilemma of being in a dualism that's a non-resolvable dualism. And what I'm trying to say is that in my work with people, I'm confronted with these issues. In my work with theory, in my trying to understand theory, I'm presented with these issues of what theory takes account of these things. How does theory take account of these issues? And what is the status of these ideas? How do they operate in me, and how do they operate in theories, and how do they operate in people's behavior? Danny?
It seems like it's the same thing as, when we were growing up, the thing about a wave or a particle, and it's both.
Yeah. Depending on where you're looking at it, it's one or the other. And I don't know where this leaves us right now. I'm kind of talked out. I'm not used to lecturing this long. I usually work in the middle of it.
If you were doing a session, we should be able to recognize whether or not the person is viewing himself or herself as a continuum or a container, and what kind of intervention you're doing with respect to that.
Yeah.
That should become something that we can see if we develop an eye for it.
Right. Yeah. That's what we could do. So it's 5:30. Does anyone want to volunteer to do 15 minutes of work, of exploring where you are with my intervention, my guidance? My sense is none of you want to, so.
Don't be so quick. It usually takes 2 minutes for someone to sit up.
Okay. Dennis, you want to try? So can you say what's going on now? What are you aware of?
Oh, I'm aware of a sense of self-consciousness and being in front of a group, a little uneasiness in my stomach. I can feel the pressure of my back against the chair. Tightness, a little tightness in my throat as I speak. My arms on the chair. I'm aware of the running water, the sound of the running water outside. An internal sense of excitement. Not a tension, just an excitement.
Is it an all-over excitement, or is it located anywhere? More prominent somewhere than other parts of you?
It's almost feels like it's not located any place specifically. Like it's almost like a mental construction that I don't search quickly and didn't find it any place.
But you feel excited.
And now a little calmer.
Uh-huh. Okay.
And I feel a settling in the chair a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Just settling in.
Mm-hmm. You seem to want to close your eyes. Can you do that? So I'm assuming going inside feels comfortable, and I wonder if you can sense what is giving you comfort, what is giving you a sense of that this is what I want to do, is close my eyes and stay there for a while. I'm assuming that, I may be wrong.
It's a sense of containment and wholeness. With my eyes open, I'm drawn to the outside. I'm drawn to your presence. I'm drawn to the room, the light, the door, the floor, and I'm pulled in so many directions. It's difficult to sense my internal processes when I have my eyes open because of the intensity of the draw of my attention external to my being.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'm finding out from him what he's doing, what he's experiencing with himself. And I would say a theme I would like to introduce now to play with is what's familiar, what's unfamiliar. As a theme, like go back and forth between what's unfamiliar is blah blah blah, what's familiar is blah blah blah. Make up sentences with that. It's shifting back and forth between.
Can you give me an example of what's unfamiliar, such as?
If you look around the room, I'm assuming when you look around the room, you're feeling like not identified with parts of the room.
I'm feeling less completely integrated as a self when I look around the room.
Okay,
Like
good.
I lose my identity
Looking at you.
because of the attachment of my attention all over on the outside.
All right, good. Okay. Uh-huh. So, can you say something, look around the room and say something in terms of, when I notice such and such, I don't feel what?
I don't feel present within my body
When I notice?
when I notice windows and the ocean and the trees and the outside.
Mm-hmm.
And with my eyes closed, I feel most recently an internal quiet
Mm-hmm.
and wholeness, and then I feel clearly the sensations in my body, a slight
Mm-hmm.
pain in my leg that disappears after a few seconds, and I'm not as aware of those, or I'm almost unaware of those when I look around the room.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So you lose insight when you're outside. Is
Yes,
another way of
yes,
saying
yes.
it. Mm-hmm.
I know the inside's there, but I lose a sense of it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
As if there's just so much attention to go around, and when the majority of it's outside, then there's less to be distributed inside.
Mhm. 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 And when you go inside now, what do you return to, or what comes up as foreground?
A sense of calmness, a sense of wholeness and calmness, and more aware of the body sensations, slight sharp pains and contacts with furniture and voice. I think I'm more aware too of the passage of time when I'm internal. That is, there seems to be in the stillness, time seems to slow down, whereas in the external time disappears.
Mhm. Okay. Can I ask you to use a possessive pronoun when you describe a phenomenon? When I lose my time, or when
I lose my sense of time.
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm. So, what I'm assuming here is one of the themes he's just said several times now is time. He's brought up the theme of time. And I'd like to explore that now. What does that mean to him? What does time mean to him? By using the chair, that I'm assuming that subjectively there's a part of himself that is dealing with the object time. And I want to test that now. So stay where you are. And this is the way we do it in Gestalt, is that if there's a subject-object split in the person, or a subject-object differentiation, then we're going to try and ask them to explore it. Now, this is a hypothesis. I'm going to test it. If it works, it's fitting. If it doesn't, I drop it. So, can you talk to time? You're the time in my life, and I...
You're the time in my life, and at some moments in my life, I'm aware of your presence, and your presence feels like a continuum, or I feel it's a continuum. At other times, at other experiences in my life, I am unaware of you. I'm so drawn to the external that I don't know you exist.
Okay, go over there and be time. What is your relationship to Dennis? Let me suggest trying, I'm the time that you have. See what happens.
I would say that I am a constant quality. In your life you have, let's say 85 years, and I'm that period of 85 years, and you can ignore me, or you can accept me, or you can look the other way, but it's almost irrelevant to me what you do with me, or how you feel about me. I'm there anyway.
switch and let's see what he said. Does this feel vital and interesting to you, this theme?
Not, not especially interesting.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm.
I have no strong attachment to
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
the question of time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let me suggest making one more statement and then
Mhm.
I'll just drop this theme. So, what would you say to time in return?
I would say I'm aware of the limit that you've stated, and I'm comfortable with either a sense of your presence or not a sense of your presence. I'm comfortable either way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's let you give me a direction again now. Let's wait a bit now and find out what comes up next for you. What do you think about or remember, or what emotions come up now?
What comes up is a fear of being the wrong subject for this experiment because I feel so calm when I sit here, and there's no struggle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I feel a little uneasy about
Mm-hmm. That you're failing me or the group in some way?
yes, that I'm not being the dynamic possessor of or a problem that's highly emotional, highly charged, and tears and
Mm-hmm. 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 Can you try this? It seems like you're describing being contented. Can you go on describing this? I'm contented while I'm what?
yeah. With my eyes closed, there's a sense of stillness.
Change
within.
that to possessive pronoun. I feel
I feel my stillness, my quietness, my contentedness. I am also aware of sounds, of rushing water,
Mm-hmm.
the body sensations of seat on the chair, arms on the chair, the coolness of the air, a slight light pattern that's filtering through my eyelids, slight pressure around my waist of the pants, on touching my body.
Mm-hmm.
Slight moisture, wetness in the palms of my left hand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can you describe what gives you a sense of contentment? No?
Just it seems to be the state I'm in. Just a state.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
But what are the components of that state?
a sense of peacefulness and quiet, very little mental activity.
Uh-huh.
I'm not thinking when I'm here. I'm not. My mind isn't sweeping in and out with
Uh-huh.
thoughts and ideas.
Uh-huh. Okay, so I feel like that's enough. So what I would say is that you're at a state of equilibrium, that you're really not swayed one way or another, nothing is compelling, and you're just in a state of equilibrium and contentment at this point, which is also a state of being.
Mm-hmm. And I must say, I just came up from a massage.
Uh-huh.
That
Might be.
explains it.
Might be part of it.
Uh-huh. Okay, let's stop now. I have to take a break to go to the bathroom, and I'll come right back and talk about that.
But I have to say.
So in working with Dennis, like and just listening to his reporting of his awareness, his continuum of awareness, it's pretty clear, I think, to all of us that there's nothing compelling going on. There's no agitation, there's no disturbance in his equilibrium. He's kind of at rest. That's a state we reach at some of the time. That this cycle of the emergence of a Gestalt and a pressing formation of need isn't there right now for him. More or less, he's in balance. He's at a 0 point. And after a time, there will be a point where he leaves that, but right now he's there. So in working with someone that's in that state, all you're going to do is, all the job is in Gestalt, is to just stay with what's there for them. Doing this work doesn't mean that it has to be a dramatic episode of catharsis and integration and crying and eating pillows and things. That isn't what Gestalt is about. Gestalt is about integration. It's about integrating aspects of yourself that are disowned or rejected or not even known, and to help the client assimilate their experience so that they have a sense that this is where I am at this point in my life, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, neutral or mixed. There is a sense that we're trying to establish, like in Buddhist meditation or in spiritual practices, of like, what does it feel like to be able to go with whatever flow is happening with you. And that's also for me as a clinician, that when people come to me and they're in a place like where Dennis is, it's incumbent on me not to push for some dramatic episode or something that's not there. I'm not here to press for something. I'm here to be with and join the person, be a companion in terms of how they go through their experience. And much often, a lot of the work can be about working with people whose whole orientation is everything has to be work. It may be very, very important for a person, a client, to recognize that there are other things than working when you come to work with your therapist, that you're coming to sort of hang out with yourself. And that doesn't necessarily mean you need to push for change or betterment or looking for something that's not there. A lot of it is the process of accompanying a person as they explore their experience, their existence, is normalizing or making normal all the different episodes that go on in a person's life, that they can be normal. They can feel themselves okay by not performing. And that was clear for him. He felt okay not performing. There was a moment in the beginning he felt like maybe I should perform. He felt anxious and a little bit of the disturbance around that, but then he kind of settled into himself. My only intervention, I think, that caught hold here was I noticed that he kept closing his eyes. And I asked him to follow that up, that maybe that brought him more and more into his interior rather than the exterior. And he described that nicely, that when I go out, I lose my sense of centeredness, my sense of being okay the way I am. Or I'm not, as he said, used my continuum metaphor. He said, I'm not a continuum, I'm contained when I close my eyes. So, I'd like to hear feedback or comments from you. What comments or feedback do you have about this afternoon? Say, Tori?
No, I don't have a lot of comments specifically. It's valuable for me to see what your model is when you're working.
Mm-hmm.
I can get dragged into philosophical discussions pretty easily. It's something that I indulge myself in sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And that isn't really the point. The point is that as I hear you expressing it, this is a model I work from, and it's effective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was a very interesting talk to you. I still have the feeling that I missed you at the beginning, maybe because I wasn't here yesterday, or it was something maybe what to continue.
Yeah.
And this continuum and container, two wonderful expressions for me, and very useful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Danny?
Oh, this one to you. I was just playing with, I was looking at the pictures of Dick on the wall, and I was thinking about sort of like Esalen and the history, and like trying to fit that into the container and continuum.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow that to keep evolving, but like one thing I really love doing is honoring the roots.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be, I'm not sure what that is, if it's a container. I guess it doesn't much matter, but it's just an interesting way to think about things, and sort of going into the container and allowing it to be a continuum,
Mm-hmm.
or going into the continuum and to keep being aware of the container. It's sort of like inside and outside that,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, after a while, maybe they're not all that different.
Mm-hmm.
But it's fun. I mean, I enjoyed it. It feels like there's some seeds that you see where they go to.
Mm-hmm. Dennis?
Yes, on the question of the continuum and the container, again, I look to a tree,
Mm-hmm.
and I see a tree, which is the container, i.e. the form of the tree, the shape of the tree. This is a tree, it's wood, I hug it. But if I look in detail, it is a continuum.
Mm-hmm.
It is a process of flow. It's the cracked bark, it's the sun on the tree, it's the warmth in different sides, it's the flow of the molecules up, it's the leaves fluttering in the breeze. When you look in detail, it is a continuum.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect that we are similar. There's a Seymour over there, but within Seymour, continuously, there's fluctuations in all of these properties that we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yes?
So Danny, your comments about Esalen, I think maybe a useful analogy about the container continuum. So I'm really glad you're here, Danny, because in many ways you epitomize that continuity, and Seymour, you've been here forever also. So my sense is lots of people come to Esalen and have no idea who Dick is. Or they think Seymour's some guy who just came down to teach some workshop. And they don't know that history at all. And I know a little bit of the history. And so my experience sometimes, I think I get to understand or to integrate, I don't want to use that word. Because I know a little bit about the history, certain events fit better.
Mm-hmm.
And some things don't fit. I mean,
Mhm.
I say that's not Esalen, that's not. So it's almost like I have this, but what I'm doing then is rejecting certain things because they don't fit into my concept, my sense of self for Esalen. And I don't know if it's right or not. And my sense is lots of people come to Esalen and have none of that and have really strong experiences. So, what am I saying? So what value does having a sense of self have for Esalen? Or what value does a sense of self have for me? I mean, I get nostalgia. I mean, one thing, if there's no self, there's no nostalgia. There's no going to Danny B's slideshows and seeing all the old photographs of you and people like that when you look so different. What am I saying? So is there any merit to that? Is there any healthiness in that? So Esalen's sense of self, what does that give me? Or my own sense of self, what does that give me? Yeah, it's puzzling. I enjoy that much more now, your choice to say there is no self, because it does set up that debate or something. So in my life, most people I know, we probably stick to the container too strongly. And I don't know a lot of people who stick to the continuum too strongly. And they're just, when they get stuck or something. People I know who are stuck, they're not stuck because they're just floating the continuum, they're stuck because they have some sense of how the world's supposed to be or how they're supposed to be in the world, and it's not serving them.
Mm-hmm.
I can imagine another culture or something where people are oriented differently, so it'd be worthwhile to shake them up by saying, hey, there is a sense of self. But my sense is, in probably your world also, we're probably more stuck on the self. So to shake that up, just get people to think about when it works and when it doesn't. Let me shift a little bit. When you were working with Dennis, and maybe this is just because I like blood or something, when he was so contented, when his eyes were closed and inward, and when he opened his eyes and went outward, I noticed that he was looking up here, and none of us sit in chairs, so we're all down here. So what I noticed was you weren't looking at people. My sense is people are far scarier than things like that. So I was curious that I imagine you're nicer than I probably would have said, why don't you look at people and make eye contact and tell me what's that like, and go into that and then contrast it. Okay, you've got this peacefulness inside. What's happening outside?
Mm-hmm.
So my question to you is that just because I'm mean?
Yeah. I think at that point, that was clearly an intervention that I could have made and pushed for. But I don't believe in pushing people. I believe in following people. I believe in, I'm trying to find out where he wants to go in order that I'm staying attuned to his authentic needs and issues. So I'm following where he needs to go. I may push, and like I did with the chair with time, or there was a point where, yes, I could have said, stay outside, assuming that would be more uncomfortable for him. But I was assuming there was a healthy, what can I say, tide within him to find his balance. He was in his balance. It's not my job to upset someone's equilibrium. It's my job to follow where they go with their attention. And in that way, I'm not imposing my values or my intervention strategies on them too much. It's impossible not to pose or present and say, okay, do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that. But as doing the work as I understand it is a play between 90% following and 10% leading, shifting back and forth.
And I don't know whether the result would have been so different.
Uh-huh.
But really, because I think you might be have gotten comfortable as well after looking around. I had the impression that it was mainly the new situation he had to get adapted in.
Right.
And closing his eyes helped him to do it faster.
Uh-huh.
But it seemed obvious for me that you are in a very content situation, and what you said at the end, that you just got a massage, just proved it in a way.
Uh-huh.
So that's how I experienced the session.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think I'd like to come to a close now, and I have one more session to do with the group for this theme. And a week ago or so, a couple weeks ago, you and I watched those Fritz films, remember?
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I've got Danny to loan me these films, and I think Thursday night what I'm going to do is show these old Fritz films.
Mhm.
And they're a group of films that I saw, I told you this earlier, they're a group of films I saw in '71 or so.
Mhm.
And they had disappeared then. There were a whole series of color films that Fritz made in Vancouver when he left here and went into Vancouver. Somehow they disappeared. Well, I'm looking at Danny's collection, his what do you call it? Archive. And here he's got these films. And I'm watching them, and Yuta came in, and we were both quite interested in watching old Fritz Perl's films of how Fritz worked and what he was doing in his last year. So I think I'm going to put up a sign, see if I can gather some more people,
Oh,
and present, let's say, Fritz films, and then talk about them after, or a little bit before, and then show you. And I think some of you have never seen these films. You've probably seen the old black and white of Dora and
Birth of a
Rogers, and those films are pretty old and not as good a quality as these films. These are really interesting films.
You could do that for a Wednesday night gig.
Huh?
You could do that for a Wednesday night gig, I think.
Of Fritz films, yeah.
Yeah.
I could probably, but let's do it Thursday night. I think
Do it
that will
twice.
spark up.
Start
I
with
feel
this.
the need to do my job in some way, bringing some more people into this house too. So spread the word around about that. I'll put up a sign and I'll see you Thursday night. Okay.
It's good that you're such a continuum. Thank